Please remain seated. The show will begin in 3, 2...
Like a Hellcat. For more awesome content, like and subscribe now.
It has been 48 years since I've been living in Barcelona, Spain. I was 9 at the time, residing on a ranch with many acres that belonged to my late uncle, which was bought by my grandparents. My name is Gabriella, and I'm now 56 years old, working as a carpenter in my late father's company. I fought tooth and nail in order to be able to grow into the woman I am today, because of the traumatic experiences I had as a young girl in Central America. It all began in the summer of 1976. On a Monday evening, I had been playing hide-and-seek in the backyard with my 12-year-old cousin Felipe. It was a hot, blistering night in June, and it was like 92 degrees outside. We both decided to go fishing out by the river, so we packed our things and went far north. My father was asleep on the couch, drunk as usual, and my grandparents were out in the city attending to their produce stand, as they often sold food like eggs, meat, and fresh fruit to make extra money. We were walking around for about a few hours, and it eventually was 10:30 when we sat down on a couple large flat rocks and got out our fishing gear. We had a lantern lit, and we had my Doberman, Bruno, nestled beside us. We were conversing, talking about all the fun things we had planned. Then, after a moment or two, Felipe got rather quiet and appeared seemingly distracted by something. He looked nervous, his blue eyes shifting left to right, and he just kept scanning the various trees. The area we were in was crawling with buzzards, toads, and wildlife. But for good measure, my cousin kept his pistol attached to his hip, in case we ran into trouble. I asked him what was wrong, and Felipe wouldn't look at me at first. He just stared into an empty space, holding his fishing line, and shuddering a bit as I placed my hand on his shoulder. I slowly take my hand away as he began to speak, and I could tell in his tone of voice, as well as in his eyes, there was fear behind them. "I'm not sure if you'd believe me," he replied, briefly glancing over at me to meet my gaze, before then gazing in his own reflection in the water. Felipe then cleared his throat and straightened his posture, then letting out a sad sigh. "Do you remember my friend from school, Pedro?" I arched an eyebrow curiously and slowly nodded. "Yes," I responded. "What about Pedro?" Felipe was hesitant, setting his fishing pole aside and twiddling his thumbs, pondering silently and then running his fingers through his curly brown locks. "He and I went camping west from here when he came to sleep over, when you were at the hospital having your operation. And we got separated when we were hunting for bears and elk. This was 6 months ago, and you know how I wasn't allowed to have anyone visiting the house without permission? Well, I invited Pedro when no one else was home, and for whatever reason, I was forbidden to go into the woods at all. I didn't know it then, nor understood why Abuela or Abuelo had acted strangely or irrationally. I just did what I wanted, and I didn't expect what would happen." I then inched closer, taking his hand in mine. "Did Pedro get kidnapped by someone?" I asked him. Pedro went stone cold and then quickly got up, pacing. "I'm sorry, I can't say much more," he said. "We should go home." Felipe began packing up, and once he gathered his belongings, he started hurrying along and continuing to examine his surroundings cautiously. I had remained with Bruno and decided to explore the other side of the river. I carefully hopped from one rock to the next, and shining the lantern, I stopped at this steep slope and slid down once Bruno made his descent down the hill. I then discovered this big wooden bridge. The air then dropped in temperature. It was bone-chilling, and I could feel a rush of cold air travel up my spine. I stood stock still, and Bruno started barking and snarling, drooling at the mouth and baring his teeth, directing his attention at the bridge. As I looked behind me, I don't know what compelled me to. I just had a bad feeling that there were eyes looking at me from a distance, maybe 5 yards away. The wind picked up and howled. Bruno kept making racket, and I couldn't get him to stop. A mist engulfed the section of the woods I was in. Through the mist, the silhouette of a very thin-looking person had fluidly hovered above the water. Once the mist faded, it appeared to be a woman, probably in her mid-20s to early 30s. She had her head hung low, her long black strands of hair covering her porcelain face, wearing a traditional bridal gown. This woman let out this wailing, these pained moans, and I was frozen, completely mesmerized by what I had been seeing in front of me. I kept the lit lantern shining directly on her, and with the sound of the bones in her neck, as well as the joints in her fingers, making this crackling noise, she slowly raised her head. With her veil flowing in the wind, she turned to look deep into my eyes, her hollow, soulless pupils emitting these yellow orbs. Inky tears of blood trickled down her cheeks, and her teeth were rotted, her face melting, exposing some skeletal features. My heart sunk deep into my chest, and my stomach dropped when Bruno began whimpering now and managed to break loose from the leash and bolt out of there. I called for him as I looked away from the bridge again, and looking back, I noticed the woman had drew nearer to me. The strands of her hair slithered like snakes. I hightailed back to the slope, and I could hear the woman having these screaming fits. Her cries carried with the wind, echoed and faded in and out in some sort of steady rhythm, and I staggered up the slope to jump off, and then suddenly I felt the strands of hair wrap around the flesh of my neck and tighten. I gasped for air, trying to claw the hair away from my throat. I couldn't yell, I just struggled to call for help. I was being dragged across the stream and was pinned underneath the water. I tried to keep my head above surface, and I couldn't breathe for more than 10 seconds. In that moment, I thought I would die. During lightning flashes, the woman's face smiled more as she looked down at me. I then shouted out a prayer in Spanish, as I finally managed to get the hair strands away as I pulled, prying the strands off of me. I then splashed through the water that was thighs deep, and I climbed all the way up the hill, and I could hear Bruno barking again. The woman was yelling even louder, and I ran even faster. Didn't plan on stopping till I reached the ranch. I then blacked out and collapsed when I made it to the front porch, and I woke up in bed the next morning. I tried to explain to my family about everything, but my own father didn't believe me. My grandparents attempted to share their knowledge about the woman, but my father rudely dismissed them. I'd lie awake every night, hearing that woman outside my window. I wouldn't sleep. I'd be drained of physical energy. I'd sleepwalk. I'd have these seizures. I wouldn't eat sometimes. I eventually learned about the weeping woman, La Llorona, who in 1673, named Maria, was married to a noble soldier, and they had 2 sons together. She came from a background of poverty, and the man was from a wealthy family. Unfortunately, Maria had gotten older, and her beauty was diminishing, and the man got bored of his wife and left. Maria became a beggar with her 2 sons, and some time later met her former husband and his new younger wife when they rode into town. Coldly, the man paid no attention to Maria, and willingly greeted his children warmly. As they departed, something in Maria snapped. She angrily pulled her sons along, and without blinking an eye, threw her sons into the raging river. They pleaded desperate cries for her to help them. All Maria could do was watch as the tide carried them away to their demise. A crowd gathered, and the man, the father of those 2 boys, also watched the chaos unfold. completely distraught, as frantic bellows sounded through the crowd, and Maria had no expression. Some say she felt guilt that day, and others say she was proud of the heinous act she committed. Maria then threw herself into the river and drowned. It is said La Llorona is doomed to wander for all eternity and search for her children that she killed till she can be redeemed and go to heaven. But for centuries, she's been known to snatch away other children to replace the ones she lost.